Early childhood education has a very westernized European view, but when we look at a wider view, we have a lot of historical components in early childhood history. I'm going to focus on three main cultural movements: the African American movement, the Native American movement, and the Latino movement. Basically, we're going to start with African American movement, and we see that throughout history, African Americans have been denied power. And so we begin the education of slaves being denied education. It was illegal to teach slaves to read or write, and they were definitely not allowed to attend any school. Um, we actually, if you skip to the very bottom of the information, true the true elimination of segregation for African American children did not officially happen until 1954 with Brown versus the Board of Education. And that's a very well-known case in education for all learners. But we do find that in among the time where slaves were denied education and when segregation was abolished, some things were happening within the segregated schools. So we find that after the Civil War, that African Americans were finally able to learn, but they were learning in black educational schools. But in the late 1800s, there were colleges that were established, and these universities were training teachers to meet the needs of their population. And there's some wonderful teacher education programs that came out of here, and lab schools. We find that in 1896, the National Association of Colored Women, NACW, was founded, and Mary Church Terrell was the daughter of enslaved parents, and she is the person who earned her college degree, later went on to have a master's, and became a strong supporter of early childhood education for the African American community. Through this, we see the beginnings of the establishment of kindergarten for African American children throughout the country. So this was a big turning point in getting children younger than 6 or 7 some early childhood experiences that they weren't allowed to have at that point. We also see in 1927 that nursery schools were founded in the United States, and the first black nursery school was founded by Dorothy Howard in Washington, D.C., and it was open to serve professional families. That also around the same time, laboratory schools were opening in our African American colleges. And so we really see an improvement in early child education because they were given the opportunities to observe children firsthand and establish their own policies to meet their population and learning needs. Now, when we look at Native American education, the Native American population is really grouped together when they shouldn't be. There are so many different cultures, identities, and languages within the Native American culture that it's its own distinct population. So we do see, though, that today half of Native Americans live in urban areas and they're not in reservations. I know that I have had several Native American children in my classrooms, and it is important to know their heritage and also know how to interact with them because there are different expectations, and they do. They look at praise and punishment a little bit differently than us. They're a different culture than the population we traditionally have in our classrooms. But what we find is in the 19th century, children were being removed from the reservation to go to boarding schools. The problem with this is the children were not allowed to continue to wear their native dress, speak their native language, and have their cultural traditions. They basically wanted them to assimilate into the European world and not become Indians. And so we see that this continued for quite some time, and then we had a shift in, let's see, oh, late in the 19th century to have some schools established on the reservation. So the children were either removed or they were given some schooling on the reservation. These native schools were not of very high quality, and teachers did not have a lot of training. In in 1894, William Haleman tried to implement a kindergarten based on Froebel's ideas on a reservation school, and also tried to implement teacher training for these reservation schools. And this was the first time we really saw that. Now, jump ahead to 1928, and there was a government investigation done called the Merriam Report. And this concluded that the way that we had been treating our Native American populations by removing them from their tribes or the lack of quality schools on the reservations was detrimental to the health, social, and economic well-being of the Native American population. And so we saw a shift in education to include the progressive education practices that at this time were being implemented in other school situations. We also learned the importance of connecting the family and their traditions and the community together within the school instead of trying to have them assimilate. The students were much better learners when they could be part of their normal population. Between 1965 and 1978, there were significant changes again to the Native American education experience because funding finally became available to public schools, and this allowed public schools to meet the needs better of our Native American population. And it also allowed parents and tribal leaders to be more involved in the policies that dealt with their population's education. The other significant area of Native American education that really relates to our early childhood education movement is Head Start. And Head Start for the Native American communities started with early education and gave services to children, especially services to children with disabilities from the Native American population. And this is something that is ongoing today, and we see today the American Indian and the Alaska Native Head Start programs are located in 26 states, and these promote home language and cultural identity inclusion. So we are teaching students in their tribal languages. We have teachers who are fluent in the tribal languages, and this is really instrumental to success of Native American education programs. When we move to Latino education, we know that the Latino population is growing in our classrooms in the United States. Spanish is the #1 language spoken other than English, and Spanish is spoken in the United States. The second highest country to have Spanish speakers would be the United States, second behind Mexico. And I find that really interesting when you look at all the other countries that speak Spanish. We have students in our classrooms that are from the Latino culture from Mexico, Puerto Rico, Cuba, and then various Latin and South American nations. And basically, the focus on the cultural movements within Latino education are the institution of dual language and bilingual programs in classrooms. So traditionally, before 1920, our country was founded on many different countries of people, Native people coming to the United States. And so education was, yes, provided in English, but there was so much education going on in other languages that it really wasn't a problem if you didn't speak English. In 1920, we find that bilingual schools were abolished. And this is around the time of World War II. And we really wanted to Americanize education. We wanted everyone to be loyal to our country. We wanted one united language, one united culture. And so we changed schools, and students had to learn in English-only immersion programs. And this is where they sat in a classroom and only English was taught. Anyone who has studied the history of education knows that this was not very successful. When you think about it, if you speak a language other than what is being spoken in your classroom, you're not going to get the content that they're teaching. I know I personally wouldn't. But this did continue for about 40 years, and it wasn't until 1960 that modern bilingual programs were started. They actually started around 1963 in Miami. And the first programs were immersion programs where we had dual language classrooms. This means instruction in the classroom was taught in 2 languages, and Spanish was the second language along with English. We found that this was a very promising way to educate our second language learners, because they were learning in their language and they were also learning in English at the same time. It was also beneficial to our students who were English-only speakers, because they were getting a second language. And if you think about the state of Miami, we have such a high Spanish population down there. To be an English speaker and learn a second language that is spoken by people around you is beneficial for everybody. So around the 60s, we saw this change. And this was established then, trickling across the United States, and continued through the 70s. But we saw that even though we had programs that were dual language, they were not really meeting the linguistic and cultural needs of our students. So we had the language in the classroom, but culturally, we still were not giving them, we're not celebrating their culture. And in 1973, the Bilingual Education Act was established, and this was basically to change policy and look at education to include the linguistic and cultural needs of all children. And this is when we saw the programs kind of branch out, where we now have English as a second language programs and teachers in schools, and we're pulling children out of classrooms to give them instruction in English and then support their first language. And these are the kind of programs we're seeing now in classrooms. That started in about 1973. Now, another change is to Head Start. We see that in 1972, the Head Start program was established, and the Head Start program was established for our bilingual learners. And this gave children the ability to maintain their cultural identity, and it required that staff had to speak the primary language of the children and be knowledgeable about their culture. When you think about that, that's a pretty big deal. In 1982, the Child Development Associates had established that candidates who have a working knowledge of 2 languages and provide well-prepared staff to dual language learners had to be part of each program that Head Start had. This continued on and has been revised several times, but we see that Head Start and early Head Start really are targeting these populations of English as a second language learners. It also targets their families. It's getting help to their families to learn English. It's getting help to our young learners with our early Head Start, that they're getting the care and the health services they need. And this has really benefited our population of Latino learners. So these are some of the cultural movements for early childhood education within the wider view of history.